Welcome everyone to today's insightful conversation. I am so thrilled to be joined by Louise, a distinguished book contributor and expert in project and portfolio management. Louise's chapter delves into the fascinating evolution of PMOs, shedding the light on the rise of the Chief Project Officer role and transformation of this profession. So in this engaging discussion, we will explore Louise's motivation behind joining this endeavor and uncover the historical roots of PMOs, spanning over the century of organizational evolution. Louise's expertise as a lecturer at the University of Cape Town brings invaluable insights into this crucial aspect of PMO. So let's go. Hi, Louise. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hi.
You're one of our book contributors for the PMO community on the topic, the rise of the Chief Project Officer, the evolution of the PMO. And let's talk about your chapter. And the first question is actually why you decided to join this challenge, other than I just messaged you randomly and invited to contribute a chapter. Why did you?
Right. It's interesting. I think you and I may have had a similar experience. A few years back now, I was asked to contribute a chapter about project management. And it was a lovely experience, and I got to meet lots of people. And then when you came up with the idea about PMOs, there was a bit of me went, oh, that's a great idea. We've not done one about PMOs before. And also it's one of my research areas. I work at the University of Cape Town. I'm a lecturer there. So PMOs happens to be one of my research areas. And I thought, yeah, I could talk about this. So you inspired me, Amy. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And your part is about the history of the PMO. Could you walk us through it briefly right now?
Absolutely. I mean, I have to do about the history because I teach the PMO stuff. And when you asked about it, I thought, I wonder if people would generally like to know. And so I started by going back over 100 years to tell you a little bit about that. I'm not that old, so I had to go back into the research. And there's a guy at University of Queensland, I think it is. I've spoken to him, John Whitty, who'd actually gone out of his way to find out about it. And one of the problems we have looking back in history is they weren't called PMOs. They were called a whole load of different things. So he had looked back and he said, well, these look like PMOs. And they are all, if you go back 100, even 120 years ago, we had things that looked like project offices, which were primarily being used by government. And they were using them because they had these really big initiatives going on and they needed to coordinate across. And when I talk about big initiatives, I'm talking about things like wars, really, really big things that they needed to coordinate finances, they needed to coordinate limited resources. And so we see that emergence of what you might think about as the first project offices. And that went through until the early part of the last century. And there was almost like a change because of a large corruption case in America. And we start to see project offices now being used, not just because things are big in government, but because there was a realization that there was a need for transparency. If we're going to give government lots of money and ask them to do things with our money, there was suddenly this recognition that there was a need for transparency. And you see project offices, what they were called then, being used by government to establish some kind of ethical transparency process across multiple projects within government. So we kind of got that government theme going on all the way through the early part of the last century. And then as you get into the 1950s, again, big projects, things like the NASA projects and programs. Again, a lot of coordination going on. Huge amounts of money being spent, and we see NASA developing lots of project approaches and using project offices in that way. Now, if you go into my own personal experience, where I started, we started to see, I mean, in those days, they were probably called project control offices, and you saw them in construction, you saw them in engineering, people like BAE Systems I worked with, where, again, massive engineering projects, Rolls-Royce, and where there, in that environment, engineering construction, project offices were used to control things. So they were there to control, again, mega project development. And that changed over time because people recognized project offices were useful and we started to use them elsewhere. So like IT, you see going into the 1970s, 1980s, you see IT starting to use them. But now it wasn't just about control. Control was good. I mean, we had control systems, we had abilities to look at statuses, but we also found that projects weren't running very well. So you now start to see this move towards what was then called project support offices. So we used to, in my early days, we'd call them PSOs, not PMOs. Project support offices were there to enable the community to be able to run projects better. And in that environment, you start to see things like the Centre of Excellences. You start to see methodologies like Prince, as it was in those days, on Prompt and Prince, the early methods coming forward. And the Project Support Office was a way of helping organisations define processes and procedures that could improve their project practices. And that's the project support process. And out of PSOs and Centre of Excellences, we see this gradual move towards getting more and more bit of project control, bit of project support, even doing health checks, all these kind of good things, the growth of the Centre of Excellence. And it's only in the last 20 years we saw that move to say, okay, so we're now getting better at running some of these projects, but are we linking to strategy? And now you start to see the move away from just project support towards project management and towards, as we see now, almost a proliferation of types of project offices, the portfolio office, the change management office, the value office. All of these are attempts to link projects more directly with the strategic focus of the company. And that, in a nutshell, is from 120 years ago to today, if you like. Does that make sense with your own experiences?
Yeah, for sure. I don't have that much experience, like 120 years. I'm also that almost, but
yes, me too.
close to 20 years. So that's what I also noticed, like the evolution from the control to support. And also my background is Ukrainian. I was born and raised in Ukraine, and my first job was in Ukraine. So there, the project management was mainly about the control. But when I moved to Canada about 10 years ago, I noticed a totally different story. I noticed that organization provides the support, and also, as you just mentioned, Louise, the Center of Excellences, the value management offices, and they're really raising leaders instead of managers. So what do you think was the pivotal moment from the control to the support? What happened in history?
I think it's because we realized we weren't doing it very well. And if you think back to the Standish reports and all of those reports, which we still quote to this day, only 30% of projects are successful, and the number doesn't seem to get any better. So I think it was that it was probably a move out of construction. So we start to see it more in the business side and the IT side. And then that recognition that actually we could do projects better. Projects were shown to be failing. And that's when we start to see, I think, the more support processes coming along to say, okay, maybe we can't just expect project managers to come along and make this work in our organizations. Our organizations are not well geared to projects, let's face it. They were geared to traditional types of work. So we were asking organizations to deliver on lots of projects, and they were failing. Partly they were failing because we weren't as good at project management as we ought to have been, and partly they were failing because the organization wasn't structured appropriately for projects to deliver. And so the project support office was fighting that gap, was bridging that gap, and allowing us, hopefully, to become better at delivering projects.
Yeah, that's very exciting. And I know that the big part of the project management is the stakeholder management. And I also know that you are passionate about this topic. And could you tell us, first of all, why you have your passion for this issue?
One of my research areas is stakeholder engagement. And I actually got involved with it because I was doing work on lessons learned. And I would go out and do lessons learned with project managers. I've interviewed lots of them, I've learned so much from them. And every time I listened to their stories, whether they were success or failure, it always seemed to me, it doesn't matter how technical they were, when I was talking to IT people, engineering people, it didn't seem to matter. It always seemed to come down to the stakeholders. So that's how I originally got involved with stakeholder engagement. And I, looking at PMOs, so bringing together my own interest in PMOs and stakeholders, and I was working in the UK at the time, and if you think back about the way we looked at project offices and assessed them, go back 20 to 30 years and you see the emergence of process-based view, which is things like P3O. I don't know, did P3O make it out to Canada or to... So you know about P3O, it's a process-based assessment. How mature are we would be a way of answering P3O. And what P3O does, it's fantastic. It tells us about the kind of functions we should implement and but it's definitely about processes. Then if you think what comes along next, and this is not necessarily a timeline, but we've then got things like the PMO Global Alliance and Americo Pinto, who did his research on the value cube. And now what's happening is that PMO Global Alliance and the value cube, what they're saying there is, okay, it's not, you can have great processes, but if they're not delivering value, what on earth is the point? So we see this value-driven approach. And what that says is PMO has to establish what value it's delivering and deliver to that value. Then we can worry about our processes. So we see that change. Now, even for the PMO value chain, and America and his research talks about this, but the other area I think we just don't bring out strongly enough is that value is in the eyes of the beholder. So the first question you perhaps even have to ask before you worry about value is, who is the stakeholder? So whose value are we going to worry about? And that's a very pivotal question. So when we look at the value, you can't look at it from your point of view or my point of view as a PMO manager. Whose value it is matters. And if you go into stakeholder analysis and stakeholder management, stakeholder engagement, one of the really basic concepts is stakeholder salience. And what's salience? And it's an interesting word, and it's been used quite deliberately. Salience says who is actually the relevant stakeholders. And that's a governance issue as well. Who's allowed to come along to the PMO and say, this is what I value and I'm your client? And that's something that PMOs have to struggle with, is they have to first of all, find the people to ask the question, what's the value? And then they have to make sure they're talking to the right people, the people who are salient, who have the power and who have the position and who have the authority and have the legitimate authority within the organization. And legitimacy is really important. I mean, one of the things I see with organizations that they sometimes fail is that they go to the loudest stakeholder rather than the most legitimate. Now, often the loudest stakeholder is, I don't know, for argument's sake, the IT director. Okay, now, so now what we do is we go along because the IT director is the one who's energy and excitement. And so we listen to their value. And then we get shot down, and it doesn't, and we should be shot down because actually what we haven't done is we haven't gone out widely and sought out to find out who are the really salient people who should have a say about what we should be delivering in the PMO. So legitimacy and energy are really important in the way we select the stakeholders that we ask the value question of. But don't just use energy, and sometimes we just use energy. The person who shouts most is the person that we start to allow to define our role, and that's when sometimes we can fail. In terms of the actual stakeholders, and we talk about this in the chapter I've written for the book, is it's one way of thinking about your stakeholders is you've got demand side stakeholders, and your demand side, all those people who want to know information from you in the PMO. So those are your C-suite, they are your steering group, they are your sponsors. They want to know about projects, and they want to know about various things about their projects. And you need to understand who they are and what do they value. And then we've also got the supply side, and that's the project managers, the people who work in Agile, one of the things we've talked about in the past. All those people who work in projects, and they supply really important information about our projects. They tell us about the status, they tell us about what's happening in them. And they have different needs and wants from our demand side. So in understanding our stakeholders, we need to look at both of those sides of the coin and then identify who's salient, and therefore going back down that chain, what's the value we're trying to give? And therefore go even further down that chain to things like 3PO, so what are the processes and practices we should be putting for? So I suppose I'm arguing for 3 levels. Understand your stakeholders, use that value approach, and then worry about the processes.
I totally share your experience, especially about the value, because sometimes people brag like, I ran 10 million or like more million project, and I manage it on time and on budget, on even ahead of time. But when I ask, what is the value of the project? What is return on investment? Did you do like market research? Do people outside of your organization passionate about this project? People don't have the answers to that. And then a project is launched and nobody's buying. And so it appears that it's an organizational waste, and it's devastating.
Absolutely. And that value process is really important to understand. And again, it's that beauty is in the eye of the beholder again, in the eye of the stakeholders. Value analysis, in the old days, we used to worry about it in terms of return on investment and all this kind of good stuff. And now we're getting to a very different view of it. No, not just the time cost quality triangle, but more of almost like a pyramid, which is made up of what does the stakeholder really, what do they really care about? What is it that which will change our organization? What is it that will make us this new state that we want to be? And interestingly, I do this with my students and I get them to talk about their projects. And although TCQ, time cost quality, was the thing that everything drove a while back, often your stakeholders are not that bothered about cost. They just want what they want. Often their timelines, they kind of target timelines rather than real ones. Sometimes they're real, but often they're not. When our project managers push back, what they find is that, well, I'd rather have what I want at the time that you can give it to me. So understanding our stakeholders' needs is a lot more complex. And I'm not saying we're more complex today. It's just has always been more complex. And that means being that human-centered stuff that we talked about, and trying to help people vocalize something which is really hard to do. Something we must recognize as project managers. It's really hard to tell somebody what you value. It's actually quite hard. So we have to help people through that process.
Exactly, totally agree. And I also like the part when you spoke about the loudest stakeholder, which we always want and need to satisfy. But I also have an experience not just with loudest, but the most demanding stakeholders who've been messaging you like 3 times per day, and also the most loudest in the meeting. And I believe that they're the most important, and we need to satisfy them first. And it's natural, like it's a human nature to kind of like cut off the noise and to satisfy these people first. But the question is like, really that important if they think about themselves, or are they challenging? So my question to you is, how would you manage these challenging stakeholders and make sure that the quiet, patient stakeholders also receive what they want?
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny enough, in stakeholder engagement, we have a term for it, which is called the magpie effect, which is where you get overly focused on those people who have the highest energy levels. It sounds like a strange thing because I mean, when I was doing the research on stakeholder management, I was talking to a lot of project managers. The most common approaches they were using were relatively basic stakeholder analysis. And I don't mean to be critical, but it would often be the kind of power and interest influence grids. I'm sure you all know them. It's power, interest, and you map them and do. But the trouble is that that's, first of all, that's pretty simplistic because there's another thing which is called energy, and which is what we've just been talking about. We actually need to know other characteristics of our stakeholders. So if they've got very high energy levels, we need to recognize that because that can sway us in different ways. And the other thing is these things that we have on these grids, we need to understand them. So understanding power, I often found, was something that project managers struggled with. They often thought of power. If I'd asked them to put somebody on the grid, if they were senior, they'd put them as high power. Now, one of the things that we have to understand in stakeholder analysis, it's not the power that the person has within the organization. It's the power with respect to my project. Now, what power do they have to allow me to be successful? Or what power do they have to stop me from being successful? And now we have to get much more intense and be able to look at things like, what do they have resource power? Do they have a lot of followers on social media if we're working on public projects? Do they have charisma? Do people like them or want to follow them? Are they very energetic? And so I think the short answer to your question is that if you're finding yourself in a stakeholder intensive project, and not all projects are stakeholder intensive, so please don't think you do this on every project, but if you're in a stakeholder intensive project, then you need to use a much wider range of understanding and analysis tools to understand your stakeholders, so you don't fall into that trap that the one dimension thing, which is the energy levels, is the thing that drives you. So you need to understand those other aspects. What are their agendas with respect to your project? What is their power with respect to your project? What I have seen, my personal experience is where I worked on massively stakeholder stakeholder-led projects, if you want to call them, then often you need a certain kind of skill, more like a change manager skill within the team, who can work with these people, who understands the stakeholders in that environment. And probably the biggest one I've worked on here in Cape Town is our integrated road transport. And one of the big program managers there, he just knew our taxi drivers, who were our problem stakeholders. He just knew their industry really well, and that was incredibly important to allow him to understand the agendas that they were coming with. But first thing is, if your project is relatively simple, don't overcomplicate it with all this stakeholder analysis stuff. If you're in a stakeholder sensitive project, you need to do probably more than just one of those 2x2 grids.
We definitely need this like 3 dimensions, like how likable the stakeholder is, how influential. All of these project managers normally forget and just focusing on the titles.
Absolutely. And then, of course, what we need to do is not worry just about communication. We need to worry about engagement. Engagement's different from communication, much broader.
Absolutely agree. And actually, that was my final question to you. So how is it different, engagement and communication? And what would you advise to the junior project managers?
It's interesting. I was just looking at an article done by UK government a couple of days ago by the Major Projects Association. And they were working with some of the industry leaders and things like water projects, stuff like that. And they were asking them about stakeholder engagement. And one of the things that had come out from that was that people were saying, we're communicating with stakeholders, but we're not engaging with them. And an example they would give is that they would give out information. So they looked at some of their projects. A lot of the time they were information giving rather than information sharing, or information, more collaborative approach. And we see that in our projects here in South Africa. One of the problems that the City of Cape Town had is it would go out to its stakeholders in our townships and it would give out information. It would send out emails and SMSs, which is great, fantastic. How many people in the townships have access to emails and SMSs? We're supposed to be engaging with our stakeholders, not just sending out some piece of paper which vaguely might hit. So I think the answer is that, first of all, you need to be aware of, in meaningful engagement, you need to identify what's the best approach that my stakeholders want to engage with me with. And that's different from communicating. It's asking the question, how should I best engage with you? How's the best way of doing with this? And the other thing is I've got to give them space. So in communication, we kind of rush it. Engagement, I have to work out what space to give them to allow them to communicate with me, to engage with me. And I have to create that space for them. And I have to make the time in the project. I can't just say, oh, well, we're in planning now. We've gone out of planning, we're executing. So we don't want any more communication. I have to build in that space to allow engagement to occur. And probably most importantly, or two most important things. One is I have to be prepared to react with what they come back with me. If you're not prepared to react to what your stakeholders tell you, then don't ask them, because you're going to make it worse. And use their voice. Don't speak in your voice, speak in their voice. So those are some of the things that came out from us in looking at very complex stakeholder projects that we kind of put together as principles. And I think we've mentioned one in the panel session, actually. And one of the last ones is it doesn't hurt to be nice. Actually, you've got to build a rapport with your stakeholders. That's a long answer to that one. Sorry, Aina.
No, that's brilliant. And I really like the part that you need to react on what your stakeholder says, because that's normally what I observe as a coach when the manager or like the team member, they communicate one-on-one and they ask each other for the feedback, and then they don't do anything with the feedback. So my feedback for them, if you don't care about the feedback, don't ask for the feedback, because if you ask for that, the person will expect that something is going to be done about it. And even if it's not your power to do something with the feedback, communicate it back that I've heard you and we're trying to work on that, but it's not going to happen like very soon, like as you expect. Don't ignore the person after that.
And it's so irritating for the stakeholders. I had several case studies we wrote up where there'd been a consultation process, and then for one reason or another, the project disappeared for a while. And then when they came back, the stakeholders didn't want to talk to them again, because they said, well, we talked to you before and nothing happened. And stakeholders don't like that. They're just like you and me. We don't like that. It's a bad experience. And therefore, people then start to say, well, I don't want to work in projects.
Thank you very much, Louise. I have 15 more questions for you at least, but we are running out of time, so we have to close this podcast at this moment. But again, thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope to see you in the next sessions, in the next panels very soon, and definitely we're going to talk about different topics.
And thank you so much for all your efforts. We know you're a volunteer, and we do appreciate it. We really do.
Thank you, Louise. Take care, and see all of you in our next episode.